Hey, what's going on guys, this is AndrewChicken and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to take a deep dive into all the different crowd control and status effects scattered throughout the game. There are more than a dozen different CC and status effects in Paladins, and it's important to understand how all of them work so you can counter them effectively. Before we get started, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any future guides, and check out my Paladins Beginner's Guide and Season 7 Champion Guide playlists linked in the description to learn more about all the different mechanics featured in Paladins. But with all that being said, let's get straight into the video. So first of all, what exactly are crowd control and status effects? Both of these affect your character negatively in different ways and are applied by enemy abilities. However, there's one very important distinction to remember. Crowd control effects actively hinder your ability to play the game by displacing you or locking you out of certain abilities, while status effects apply some kind of debuff to your character that helps the enemies without directly hindering you. In other words, crowd control effects limit your ability to play the game, while status effects make the enemy stronger in some way. For example, if you get stunned, you won't be able to use any of your abilities or move, so you can't play the game as long as you're stunned. Meanwhile, if you get revealed, the enemies will be able to see you through walls, but you'll still be in total control of your character. This distinction is very important, because certain items and abilities will affect crowd control effects, but not status effects. So how do you counter crowd control and status effects? For starters, there are two items that counter different types of crowd control effects, Sentinel and Unbound. Sentinel will reduce the potency of slows, knockups, and knockbacks, and it'll also apply a small personal shield to you whenever you get an elimination. Unbound reduces the duration of all other crowd control effects, such as stuns, cripples, and silences. Note that neither of these items counter status effects, so you can't buy Unbound to counter anti-healing. As of this video, there is no item in the game which counters status effects. Champions can also ignore or cleanse crowd control effects if they have an ability that makes them CC immune, such as Zin's Billow or Fernando's ultimate. During these abilities, no crowd control effects may be applied to them, and they may also use these abilities to cleanse crowd control effects as long as they're not already affected by something that prevents them from using abilities like a stun or a silence. There's also an important distinction between crowd control, damage, and status immunity. Some abilities have all three, while some only have two or even just one. Zin's Billow grants total crowd control, damage, and status immunity, while Fernando's ultimate only provides CC and damage immunity. Rey's ultimate only has immunity to damage, so she can still be affected by all forms of crowd control and status effects while using it. On screen, you can see a list of champions which have crowd control, status, or damage immunity on one or more of their abilities. You can pause the video now to study this, because it's important to remember as you play the game. Many crowd control and status effects can also be blocked using shields and other barriers, but this may depend on the ability that's being used. For example, the stun afflicted by Bomb King's Grumpy Bomb will be blocked by shields, but the stun from his King Bomb will not. Unlike abilities that explicitly cleanse crowd control, shields cannot be used to cleanse crowd control effects that have already been applied. In some cases though, shields can be used to block the continuous application of a status effect, such as the anti-healing effect that gets applied when you take damage. Most movement abilities will also negate the effects of knockbacks and slows. An ability like Soar or Dash, which actively pushes the character in a certain direction, will outright ignore all knockbacks and slows, but an ability like Billow will be useless against the knockback if the knockback has already been applied before you use the ability. That's because Billow doesn't actually send you in any direction, it just lets you move around while ethereal. An ability like Victor's Hustle, which is just a movement ability that enhances your regular WASD movement, will be affected by both knockbacks and slows. Now, let's discuss each of the different crowd control effects in Paladins. On the top right of the screen, you'll see which item counters the specific crowd control effect I'm talking about, listed on the top left. You'll also be able to see each champion who can use this crowd control effect with varying levels of effectiveness. When you're in a match, you'll be able to see which crowd control effects are applied to you by looking at the top center of your screen. Many crowd control effects also have visual indicators displayed on a champion's model, helping you gauge if an enemy is vulnerable or if an ally needs help. So, let's get started with our first crowd control effect, Banish. This is a very rare crowd control effect that only Atlas can use. Banish locks a target in place, preventing them from moving or using any of their abilities. They're also immune to all forms of damage, crowd control, status effects, and healing. Effectively, Banish removes a player from the match for a short period of time. This effect is visualized by the player turning orange and ethereal while gaining a large orange circle around them. After that we have the Blind, an effect exclusive to Maeve which limits the player's vision to a short distance in front of them. This effect has a minimum duration of 2 seconds, regardless of how much Unbound you buy. That said, it still doesn't work on targets which are immune to crowd control. Blind can be visualized by a circle surrounding the player that indicates the distance they can see. Next up is the Cripple. This is one of the most common crowd control types in the game, and can also be particularly lethal when used against champions who rely on their movement abilities. That's because this effect prevents players from using their movement abilities for the duration of the effect. Cripples are very good against champions with high mobility like Eevee, but are useless against champions like Tyra who have no movement abilities. Note that cripples have no effect on movement speed buffs such as Nimble, Lethality, or movement speed related cards. Cripples are visualized by a large yellow arrow on top of the player. Disarm is another extremely rare crowd control effect that, at the time of writing, is only applied on Kasumi's ultimate. It's a particularly tricky crowd control effect to deal with because it prevents players from using their in-hand weapons. Even though Kasumi's ultimate has a lot of visual effects surrounding it, the actual disarm effect has no visual indicator. The next effect is Fear, which prevents the players from using their abilities and forces them to run away from the source of the fear. Not only is it visualized by the force movement and unique feared animation that every champion has, but it also causes these spooky purple effects to emanate from the player. Next, we have a super rare CC effect limited to Strix called the Flashbang. This is similar to Maeve's Blind, but instead it completely covers the screen with a white flash, preventing you from seeing anything. There isn't a minimum duration on this effect, so you can buy Unbound to your heart's content. The starting duration of the flash also depends on your distance from the center of the explosion, so it'll last for less time if you're right on the edge. This effect is visualized by a blinding effect around the player's head. After that, there's Grip, a unique effect that only Genos and Omen can do. This interrupts a player's movement abilities and locks them up in the air, preventing them from using basic WASD movement and turning them into a sitting duck. Certain movement abilities that enhance your WASD movement, like Victor's Hustle, also can't be used during this effect. However, you can escape the grip by using a proper movement ability like Maeve's Pounce. Next, we have the Knockback, another common crowd control effect that pushes a target in a certain direction. Usually, this involves pushing the player away, such as with Ash's Kinetic Burst. However, certain abilities that pull players in are also considered knockbacks, such as Seven's Grapple and Nyx's Ultimate. However, it's important to distinguish between the knockback and the knock-up. Knock-up is a much more limited effect, and it functions a bit differently to the knockback. Knock-ups will exclusively send the player directly upward, obviously. However, it will also interrupt enemy movement abilities, acting like a very brief cripple. This makes it slightly more powerful in certain situations, but you won't be throwing anyone off the map though. Polymorph is next, which is an extremely unique effect that temporarily transforms the player into a completely harmless creature that has very little health, no abilities, and can only move. Pip and Moji are the only two characters with Polymorph, and their abilities have a few minor differences. Pip can turn multiple enemies into chickens which he and others can shoot to kill, while Moji can turn one enemy into a snack that she will instantly kill if she collides with it. Pip's ultimate will also go right through shields, while Moji's will not. In either case, if you get turned into a little helpless creature, you need to run. Atlas has another unique effect in the form of his Rewind. This is a crowd control effect that's similar to Banish, but repositions an enemy to where they were a few seconds ago, and also lowers their health to the lowest point it was at in those past few seconds. So if Atlas notices someone received a big burst of healing, he can rewind them and undo all that healing. Rewound enemies have a yellow ethereal outline similar to how they look when banished. The next effect is an even more powerful version of the cripple, the Root. Only a few characters can root, and its effect is deadly. Root not only stops players from using movement abilities, it flat out stops them from moving at all. The Root is visualized by chains at the player's feet, as well as the general fact that they're locked in place and extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. Silence is another brutally powerful effect limited to a few characters on the roster, and it prevents players from using all abilities except their weapon. In a game that revolves around ability usage, not being able to use abilities is a very bad thing, so watch out for this effect. Or rather, don't watch out for it, since there isn't any visual indicator letting you know when someone is no longer silenced. The final effect countered by Sentinel is the Slow, which reduces the player's movement speed. This doesn't affect movement abilities, just regular WASD movement. Slows are visualized by a blue arrow at the player's feet, and it also has a sister effect known as the Freeze, which is basically the same as a Slow, but visualized by a blue icy effect surrounding the target alongside the traditional arrow. The distinction between them is purely aesthetic, and makes absolutely no difference to the gameplay. And then finally, we have the Stun, a very powerful effect that prevents the player from doing anything. As long as you're stunned, you can't shoot, move, or use abilities. It's very simple and very effective, and is visualized by the character entering a stunned animation and having dazed stars float around their head. However, there are some special cases that break the conventional rules of crowd control effects. The first example is an effect that's applied continuously in a zone, most notably Eevee's ultimate and Inara's Warder's Field when using the talent Treacherous Ground. Both of these abilities will continuously apply a slow and a cripple while the player is inside the zone. Normally, you would buy Unbound to reduce the duration of the cripple, but that doesn't work for these abilities because the cripple is continuously refreshed as long as you're standing inside them. Instead, you should buy Sentinel to reduce the potency of the slow so you can get out of the zone and thus evade the cripple. There are also some crowd control effects that cannot be reduced in any capacity. Makoa's Hook and Cyrus's Convergence are the two most notable abilities which have irreducible CC. Convergence will always pull you directly to the center of the ability, regardless of how much Sentinel or Unbound you have. You can buy Unbound to reduce the stun duration after the ability is over, but you cannot reduce the displacement in any way. Azan's dash displacement also works the same way. However, Io's ultimate does technically have a reduced pickup time if you buy Unbound. The duration is just so long that you normally never get to see it in action. Yagharoth's ultimate is another example of crowd control that is impossible to counter through conventional means. If you are CC immune already, she cannot cast the ultimate on you, but otherwise, she is free to pull you in and there's nothing you can do about it except shoot her to break the second health pool she receives. The same can be said for Zin's ultimate, except your teammates need to shoot him instead because you can't do anything while he's slashing at you. Also, Lilith's Blood Moon is something that's very similar to Maeve's Blind, but it doesn't get countered by anything that cleanses crowd control nor status effects. This is because it technically doesn't hinder your ability to play the game in any way, nor does it apply something negative to your character. It turns the world red purely for aesthetic purposes, and serves only as a visual cue letting you know when her ultimate is active. Finally, it's important to mention that if an ability is not channeled, it will not be disabled by stuns, silences, or any other ability that disables ability usage. For example, if Barrack puts down a turret and then gets stunned, the turret won't just vanish. However, channeled abilities like Khan's shield will be disrupted by these effects. You can identify a channeled ability if the character cannot use any other abilities while channeling. Examples of these include Eevee's Soar, Androxus' Reversal, and Ceres' Restore Soul. Now, let's talk about what each of the status effects do. Like I mentioned earlier, these have much fewer direct counters apart from abilities that can cleanse status effects, or simply blocking them with a shield or barrier. Status effects are also shown on the top center of your screen just like crowd control effects. First, we have damage over time effects. These include effects like burn and poison, as well as any unlisted damage over time effects like Vora's weapon attacks. Simply put, this status effect will deal damage to you over its duration. Damage over time is the easiest status effect to counter because it can be mitigated by damage reduction or outright ignored with damage immunity. This means a much broader portion of the roster can mitigate or eliminate its effect, rather than other status effects which can only be cleansed by status immunity. Next, we have the most ubiquitous status effect in the game, anti-healing. Otherwise known as Cauterize, this effect reduces the healing you receive based on the amount shown on the scoreboard. I have a whole video going in detail about how you can mitigate the effects of Cauterize, whether you're playing the healer or any other class. This effect is applied whenever you get hit by someone's in-hand weapon, and it is visualized by these green vapors. There are also a few niche abilities that apply varying levels of anti-healing. Most notably, Willow's Dead Zone will completely deny all healing as long as you're standing inside of it, unless you're using an ability that makes you immune to status effects, or you're receiving a source of true healing like from Ray's ult. You can block the application of this effect with a shield as long as you point the shield towards the center of the dead zone, which is a very helpful tip if you're playing tank. After that, there's the damage debuff. This is a pretty rare status effect that causes the target to take increased damage from enemy weapons. There's also the damage reduction debuff, which has a similar name but instead reduces the damage the target deals. This enfeebling effect is even rarer than the damage debuff, and can be applied by Ray's Spirit Link with the card Midnight Stroll, or by Kasumi's curse stacks due to her passive. Finally, there's the Reveal, a status effect that lets enemies see you through walls and even during stealth. This helps the enemies get the jump on you easier and spot any attacks that you're planning even if they don't have direct line of sight. The damage over time effects can also act like a pseudo-reveal for the character that applies them because they can track the damage ticks and get a general idea of where you're going. There are also some special effects that are character specific and affect you in unique ways. These effects appear on the bottom left rather than the top center of your screen. First up, we have Moji's marking mechanic. When Moji plays the talent Jubilation, she can apply magic marks to enemies that increase the damage she does with her familiar spit. These can be cleansed by any ability that cleanses status effects, making champions like Koga particularly effective against her. Kasumi's curse stacks work in a similar way to Moji's marks, since they increase the damage she does with her yokai doll. As mentioned earlier, they're also a damage reduction debuff, so you'll do less damage to Kasumi and her team the more curse stacks she applies. And, just like Moji, they can be cleansed by any form of status immunity. Ceres also has a similar mechanic with her Soul Orb stacks. She can apply up to 4 of these on a target at once, and if a player has 4 stacks on them, she will stun them when she uses Ren Soul. Otherwise, the number of stacks influences the amount of damage you take and the amount of healing she receives from Ren Soul. These stacks can be cleansed by status immune targets just like the previous 2. Omen also has a unique status effect known as Ominous Brand. This effect causes you to receive additional effects from his abilities while it's applied to you, which is similar to, but not the same as, Moji's and Kasumi's marking mechanics. And with that last effect out of the way, that just about wraps up this video on crowd control and status effects in Paladins. As you can see, there are a ton of different effects in Paladins, and understanding the distinction between them will really help you become a better player. If you found this video to be helpful, make sure to drop a like and subscribe for more guides in the future. Also, if you want to support this channel directly to help me continue making more videos, then please consider becoming a channel member down below, or buying crystals over at nexus.gg/AndrewChicken. There you can buy crystals, DLC, and more and support this channel directly in the process. But with all that being said, thank you guys for watching, I will see you all next time, peace out.